Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung Earthlets, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, as always, Molch-R. On this episode, we have got two guests. We've got Rory McConville, who is a writer who got his big break with 2000 AD thanks to the Thought Bubble writing competition, and has gone on to write Future Shocks, but also work on Judge Dredd, Devlin War, and Kirsten Coburn, as well as Tales from the Black Museum. He's done various other bits and bobs. Really great to talk to him. He's got a new Dredd in this month's Judge Dredd Megazine with artist Ben Wilshire. And then we talk to Adam Sherif, who is somebody who really does know his comics. He writes about comics. He was formerly a comic seller at Orbital Comics in London, and also he did a lot of work with podcasting about comics, which is great. And we do a deep dive onto I think probably my all-time favourite 2000 AD story, which is Judge Anderson Shamballa, Alan Grant and Arthur Ranson at the absolute peak of their powers, and it was great to be able to chat to him about that. So yeah, sit back, relax, and enjoy this slice of the lockdown tapes. Oh, well, you've got a new Judge Dredd Megazine story.
Yes.
This week with art by Ben Wilshire. So I figured this was an opportunity because you've been a fairly prolific writer, particularly on Dredd, over the last few years. But your big break was at Thought Bubble, which was one of the writing panels, and you did that liposuction.
Yeah, that was the one.
Which
I think, was that the first time you'd done the writing competition in a few years?
You know what? I can't. My memory is so bad. I can't remember. It was either first time we'd done it ever, or first time we'd done it in a few years.
All right. Well, yeah, no, that was, I think it was 2015, so a while ago now.
Yes, 2015. So I had to just go and check. So tell me a little bit about how you got to that point. You know, it is writing full stop something that you've always wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely always in some form or another been doing it for like quite a long time, and I think 2000 AD had always been one that I've been interested in. I would have gone the more typical send in a future shot submission to the postal submissions, which didn't really get me very far. I think I remember there was a time when I was 16 and I got 4 rejections stapled together in one envelope, which was a rather harrowing moment. But I'd been working on various comics for a few years leading up to that. I'd done a couple of Irish history graphic novels, and then I'd been kind of slowly doing not future shots, but kind of short stories that I'd kind of get an artist and put one online a month. So kind of just getting myself more and more comfortable with the short story form. And then basically, because the Thought Bubble competition is one of the few opportunities for people who do want to write comics to actually get an opportunity to pitch or anything, I just spent ages practicing that pitch, and then finally got the chance to do it. Although I do remember when it was happening, because I had gone there under the impression that it would be first come, first served. And I remember you were hosting it and suddenly decided, actually, I'm just going to pick people at random out of the audience. And it was I think I might have actually ended up being the last person to actually pitch, because you'd kind of been conveniently missing me the whole time. So after the final second to last pitch, I just put my hand up and kept it there for about just straight away once it was finished, because I just, not winning would have been survivable, but not having the chance to pitch would have just been crushing. But yeah, no, it was. It turned out all right in the end.
Oh yeah, I'm glad that it did.
Yeah.
I always take my level of cruelty as a cue from Tharg.
Of course, yeah. No, it's. It's nothing on Tharg's level of cruelty, but it's aspiring to be.
In terms of your background, how did you? This is going to sound like such a bland question, and I'm so sorry. How did you decide to be a writer?
Oh
so
God. I mean, I was probably just rubbish at everything else, so it was kind of the only. No, I mean, I've always been. I suppose it was really more reading from the very beginning. It was. I think it's one of those things actually with comics in particular, the kind of serialized nature where you get, one issue a week or a month, and then you've got that gap of time to kind of invent what's going to happen in your head, and that just kind of gradually seeped in, and just, I suppose, yeah, a bland answer to a bland question.
I got what I deserved with that one.
Yeah.
So sorry. I apologize to you. I apologize to the listeners. That wasn't good. No, it's, as you say, it's that kind of reading thing. A lot of the writers that I speak to, particularly people who've come up to, have grown up in the 90s, the 2000s, etc. Is always some variation of, I liked English. I liked reading.
Yeah, English and history.
The thing that I could do, So I find that interesting. The choices that I know how I ended up being a journalist, for example. The choices that I made and the moments that put me on that path. But what were the moments that made you put you on that path?
Well, actually, it's funny you say about school, because I do remember when I was in 5th class, so about maybe 10, and I had an English teacher who, again, he had this ranking system of how he doled out marks for short stories and stuff, and he would only ever give out I think a 9 was the highest, and then there was this one occasion where I did a story that was I think got a 9.5, and it was the first time it had happened in about 5 years. So I think that was kind of, I suppose, one of those moments where you're like, okay, maybe I'm actually not the worst at this. And I'm trying to think. I mean, to be quite honest, the Thought Bubble competition was kind of one of those moments as well, because it was a slight kind of affirmation of, you're not just shooting in the breeze. You've actually, someone has responded to this idea of yours. So it's kind of I think it's, there's no one single moment, but it's just kind of gradually kind of encouraged as you go on. Sorry, I've totally wandered off on a ramble there.
No, that's good. It's good. It's that kind of, people do the Thought Bubble competitions for lots of reasons. Some because they want to be writers, some because they just want to be published in 2000 AD, some because they just want to have a go. I think there was one guy who'd flown all the way from America. I think he might have won, actually.
I remember him. He was actually was his name Billy, I think. He was the guy who was there the time I was on the judging panel. And I remember I found that out afterwards, and I was shocked. But I mean, fair play to him, it paid off, like. But
it's that motivation, and you know, so some people just have an idea for a script and think, oh, you know, I can turn that into Future Shock, and they have a go. Was it a case of you thinking, well, this is a pathway to what I want to do, so I'm gonna chip away at it, or and find my strongest idea, or was it, I've got this idea for Future Shock, I think it'd be perfect?
No, I mean there were definitely like, obviously from doing previous attempts at Future Shocks, you kind of get to know what works and what doesn't a bit. But I had like, I think I had about 3 or 4 ideas leading up to it where I kind of needed to drill down and find what was the best one. Like, I mean, it's certainly with 2000 AD ones, I mean, you've got to have like so many ideas all the time anyway. Like, so it's, yeah, it was just a case of trying to pick the best one rather than I have this particular one that needs to be told, like, and also one that has a decent twist.
It's always surprising. I don't know whether you find this, that the twist is the hardest bit of the script. To be shocking.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to be shocking like Laura Bailey was shocking, where literally the entire room convulsed.
Yeah, I wish I'd been. I've heard so much about that gasp, but I think I certainly don't think the shock at the end of the liposuction one was anywhere near as shocking as that one. But yeah, no, they are. I find, because so many have been done already, that part of the way, if you find a concept that hasn't been used, you're kind of already halfway there, because if you're in a new territory, by virtue of that, it makes it easier to stick a twist in at the end. Or otherwise, I think it's Andy Diggle was the one who said start with a twist and then come up with another twist at the end of it. So
I mean, there's different ways to structure them, but there's always got to be that twist. Because having done the competition for, however many years, 5 years, maybe more, I'm always struck by how clear it is when people have done exactly what you say, which is started with a twist and then work backwards, and those who started with an idea and then try to move towards a twist, and how more successful that your way of doing it is.
Yeah,
you know, it's and once you've seen it happen, once you've thought about how the winner has done it, it seems obvious. But I guess when you're in it, when you're trying to craft that idea, that can be pretty difficult to see your way through that process. I mean, how easy do you find the process, if you find it easy at all?
I think it varies from story to story. I mean, I think there's some ones that kind of pop up quite fully formed, and then there's other ones where you really do have to dig in a bit. But I think I found it, I think, God, I did one recently, so I think I must be on like my 10th or something. And definitely as it goes on, I do think it becomes harder to find ones that aren't kind of the risk of retreading old ground grows like exponentially larger each time, because you start to see what your areas of interest are. And there's also the other thing is finding stories that actually fit that format, because not every story can or should be a Future Shock, just in terms of like the scope of it, the tone. But like, it's, yeah, I think you have to find one that's kind of, you know, we've all heard the ones where it's kind of the first page is just raw exposition and you have no idea what the character wants or what the action is going to be by the end of it. So I think it's those areas that you kind of get better at kind of zeroing in on rather than the twists themselves. I think those always take a while to figure out when you're doing it.
Because the reason I'm asking, and what I've been trying to bring us around to, is talking about one-offs, because your time at 2000 AD has been very much filled with single stories, one-offs. And, you know, they're a major component, not just of Future Shocks, but also of Judge Dredd. So I wanted to get an idea of how important this process of constantly having to come up with a new idea, not necessarily being able to rely on continuity or supporting characters, how you find that process and how that has changed you as a writer over the period.
Let me think. I mean, definitely, I think it has made me far more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not resourceful, but you force yourself to come up with more because you're always going to need an absolute bucket of ideas. So I think I've gotten far better at making sure anything that could be a potential idea is jotted down somewhere. Because as you say, like, I mean, with a lot of the Future Shocks, and even a lot of, you know, there's a lot of dreads that are that similar kind of thing of you're essentially burning through a concept that could be an entire story, if it's one of those one-offs, like, and you just really, I suppose, you can't be precious with your ideas as well. Is another thing. I think it teaches you to be kind of like, you will always have more ideas. Yeah, I think probably. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a load at the moment.
No, not at all, not at all. Because, like I said, I'm curious as to whether the churn of ideas, the need to be constantly coming up with new hooks, hones skills as a writer. Because the Future Shock competition at Thought Bubble is intended to find somebody who can do a Future Shock. You know?
Yeah,
that's kind of like the point of the blade. That's what we're after, but that can be really difficult. You know, numerous writers have commented about how Future Shocks are the hardest thing to do, particularly after 40 odd years of them, you know?
Yeah.
So then your time at 2000 AD being characterized by lots of one-offs. You know, as a training ground, as something that quickly, you know, separates the wheat from the chaff. I'm wondering how what that has done to you as a writer, because, you know, particularly coming onto a strip like Dredd, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, there's obviously I suppose the efficiency of storytelling you need to have working on something like this. I mean, you know, when you have to tell, even more so, because whatever about Dredd, you know, you might be bringing a new character in as a protagonist, but the world itself is set up. Whereas with Future Shocks, you have to build the whole world right before you destroy it. But there's still, yeah, it's not even efficiency, it's economy of storytelling. You really can't waste any panels. And like, even when I've been doing larger projects now in the US, you know, it's a lot easier to kind of, I would think, start hyper small, learn the rules, and then go bigger, versus starting big and then having to teach yourself how to go small. I think everything you need to learn about storytelling you can do in those shorter stories, and then you can take those lessons and just know. I think it gives you a great command of pacing, would be one thing.
Well, that's something that I find fascinating, that with 2000 AD's hyper compressed storytelling, which really just comics storytelling as was,
Yeah.
without the luxury of like 22 pages. You can still undercook it. Not you personally, it is still possible to not have enough story to stretch across. I mean, what's a Future Shock now? 4 pages.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hitting that sweet spot between those two things, not overloading it, but not undercooking it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I mean, I suppose Thard would know better than I about the ones I've done that have been undercooked, but it's just a great training ground, as you say, like to kind of figure out the mechanics of storytelling.
With Dredd, was that something that you pitched for, or was it something that was offered to you?
No, it was offered. I kind of expected it would be quite a while before, or if I even was asked to pitch for Dredd at any point. I think I'd been writing about a year or so. So I'd done a few Future Shocks, a Thard's Thriller, and some Tales from the Black Museum, which I suppose was kind of the intro to the Dredd verse. And then was asked to pitch for a magazine, Dredd. And then it's been a mixture of magazine and prog Dredds ever since.
For you, as a relatively new writer, as somebody who's stepping into a field of Dredd writers, which is much wider than it used to be. So, 20 years ago, it was basically John and a handful of others, Gordon, Robbie. Now we have Rob Williams, Al Ewing, when he comes back to us.
No, I'm dead.
Yeah, Simon Spurrier, Michael Carroll. I wondered if you could explain what you think the essence of Dredd is for you as a writer, the kind of Dredd that you want to write about when you sit down to work on him.
This might sound a bit odd, but I think Dredd himself is not really a big part of Dredd and how I write Dredds. In that I think someone like, say, Rob, for example, is really big on the essence of, say, Dredd as a character. Whereas I think maybe from doing shorter done-in-ones and stuff, you inevitably end up focusing more on, citizens or side characters, because you need that, complete journey over a story. But I think the Citizens and Justice Department are actually, Justice Department as a system is kind of the most interesting area for me, and the kind of strange, like the fact that they are bad guys at the end of the day, I think is a kind of really interesting thing to explore, and the kind of strange elements of how that system works.
It's something that Rob has talked an awful lot about, how you tackling the big guy is a hell of a challenge. You've got to really know where you stand on that. So to a certain extent, people like Al and Sai tend to focus on, as you say, on the city itself, on the system. When you are looking at Dredd's account, and it's difficult with one shots, I guess, because those are exactly the kind of strips where you are exploring the city around him. Is he a cipher to you?
It changes, I think, because it's when, I think with a lot of the one shots, inevitably it's a citizen or someone who is the protagonist, and Dredd kind of just shows up to wreck their day. Whereas I suppose I've been doing a few longer stories now that haven't come out yet, where there are, I suppose, more questions that would generate a bit more conflict from him as a man. but by and large, I think he is Cypher. Yeah, maybe a Cypher. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a certain stories where he works as a Cypher, definitely.
I guess, like I said, ultimately, if you're gonna go for it, you've got to make sure that you're on target, really. Because looking at some of the Dredd stories that you've done, they very much fit into that kind of Case Files 5-ish territory. Where it's something new virtually every single week. The tone changes constantly. Sometimes you're never entirely sure what John and Alan are on, because they just seem to put it together every week with something new. With the stories that you tell for Dredd, I'm thinking maybe the slightly longer ones, like A Better Class of Criminal and New Blood and things like that. Do you find that your intent changes as you go along? You can have a nice idea, you can have a nice hook, but then perhaps as you apply the Dredd test, as it were, this agent of law and order, there's actually an agent of chaos in lives, that things change, that he changes just by existing. He is a catalyst that ruins or improves everything.
Yeah, I mean, like, definitely ruins. He ruins a lot of. I think, he typically does tend to ruin people's day in the ones I write. But yeah, no, there are ideas that definitely I have brought in that have not that have changed based on the interaction, based on having to fit within a Dredd mold. And then there's some that simply, haven't worked, but those haven't been made. So, trying to think of any specifics off the top of my head. No, sorry, nothing's.
Well, I guess one key thing I wanted to ask about was humour. Particularly with one-shots, where, so often in Dredd, it is literally a punchline. It's a liner at the end, a droll rather, and are those quite hard to do? Because I imagine kind of just setting up a situation like that to knock it down.
Well, sometimes I think once in those ones, I'm trying to think of ones, say, like the Death Watch and maybe the Eternity Hotel and those kind of ones. When you get the line, you're home and dry. I think it's once you've unlocked Dredd's line at the end, then it's you're clear. But equally, you don't want to make every single one Dredd having a line at the end. So it's important to try and like vary it up as you go. But yeah, I mean, humor is obviously such a huge part of the Dredd verse, like, and I think it's the thing that stops it from, well, being the Terminator.
I mean, you've got quite a bit of experience with him now as a character.
Yeah, he's. I suppose I do, but I still don't feel like, I don't think I could ever, at this stage, do a kind of big, long psychological examination story of him, if that makes sense. Because I just don't know, is that really where the type of story that I'd be good at, to be honest. And I think it's also important to know what your areas of interest and strength are.
I mean, what are your areas of interest and strength?
Well, I mean, I think I do comedy and zany concepts fairly well.
Because you worked for a little time on Devil in War. also you did a story on Kirsten Coburn as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested what your learning experience on those were as Dredd adjacent characters. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's funny because Dredd adjacent characters, you end up defining them in relation to Dredd. In that Kirsten Coburn, for instance, is similarly a man of few words, but there is a slight bit more direct humor. I suppose Kirsten Coburn and Devlin Waugh are still on this kind of slightly more chaotic side, with probably Kirsten Coburn being in the middle and Devlin Waugh a couple of miles down the road in pure chaotic territory. But yeah, I think when you are writing a Dreadverse character, you inevitably do end up defining their personality in relation to Dredd quite a bit. But writing on both of them was quite interesting because obviously there are certain tales that only work with certain characters. So you figuring out what works for a Kirsten Coburn story that wouldn't work for Dredd and wouldn't work for Devlin Waugh and vice versa is kind of quite helpful in giving you a better understanding.
With your writing, with a character that is already established, you worked on Dredd, you worked on Devlin, you worked on Coburn. What's your rule of thumb with looking at what's gone before, fitting into a writing style, if there indeed is one? I'm thinking because both Devlin and Coburn, one was John Smith, the other was Gordon Rennie, both with their very own particular voices. I wondered how much influence those had on you.
A degree. I mean, obviously, you make sure to research the characters and read their past stories and figure them out. But I think you want to try and honor what's come before without being strangled by it. In both cases, I was always setting out to do a continuation of the characters who have come before and those interpretations of them. So, it's trying to honor without being, I suppose, restricted by it.
And I'm really interested in your process, because as you say, you keep a note of story ideas and things like that. But I'm curious as to how much working you have to put into a script, whether it is just an idea pops into your head, oh great, fine, pop it down, or whether it's multiple drafts, whether it's working it over, whether it's letting it percolate.
It's bits of all of those, I think. I've definitely got a file that is just buckets of Dredd ideas, and then say if I'm asked to pitch for something, I'll read through those. One might jump out. I might take that, work it up into an outline. Similarly, there'll be some other folders that will have half developed ideas, relatively developed ideas, and kind of it's a lot of working over, and then I think percolating is probably a good way of putting it as well. You just need to let them sit for a while and see what comes out.
How much of your time is writing? Is it something you do full time, or is it is there a day job?
No, there is a day job writing for a startup, so it's kind of more marketing. But I would say it's about 75-25.
And one thing that I'm curious about, and when I've tried to talk to PJ, Holden, PJ maybe. When I try to talk to PJ Holden,
it's a reveal.
Yeah, and John McCrae about this. There's a lot of talent that seems to come out of comic book talent that seems to come out of Ireland. You know, you've got that cluster around Dublin. You've got people from Cork. You've got people from all over. How much are you conscious of being a part of that, if indeed you are? And if that does exist, is there a reason for it, or is it just happenstance?
I don't know. I think there's definitely. I mean, there's absolutely a strangely disproportionate number of Irish people who, for the size of the country, who end up working in comics. I wouldn't feel that part of that connected to the scene, if I'm honest, in that I think there was a generation, kind of PJ's generation, who were a bit older than me, who were kind of working ahead at that time. And then I think there has been a bit more of a group that's popped up in the interim, but I think that popped up after I moved over to England, so I timed that incredibly badly. But I know, I mean, like, I would know a lot of the Irish people, and there'd be like a few creators that I would know quite well, but not just on an individual basis versus, you know, we are a group of Irish creators who are all striving for a common goal. I do think there is, though, Irish creators do help to push each other forward and try and pay it forward as well, I think, in terms of trying to help people up the ladder.
Well, I guess that's where the value of something like the competition at Thought Bubble,
yeah,
really, because you know, it was always intended to. Ultimately, it's a selfish intention. It's to find us new writers and artists.
Yeah.
But it kind of it provides. Hopefully, it provides, and I think you're an example of this. An opportunity to learn in print in a way that doesn't necessarily exist anymore. But I mean, you've had experience putting together small press projects in the past. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about those, about what those taught you?
Yeah, so those were kind of they were about, so for about a year or so, I would do these 5 to 12 page stories, and I kind of set myself a deadline of kind of having one up every month. So I'd, you know, get a script written, pay an artist, and then put it up on I think it was a Tumblr I had. And the idea was obviously to practice, get a bit of work out there, but then also every, say, 5 or 6 stories, get those printed up and hand them out, use them as a portfolio piece, basically, at conventions and stuff. And they kind of be a range of genres. I suppose that they would be a bit more wide-ranging than, say, like Future Shots, which obviously are typically, you know, black humor, sci-fi. So there'd be a bit of magical realism, a bit of horror, a bit of sci-fi as well. But so it was kind of trying to keep your output going while also hopefully improving as a writer. And I think it's, you know, because it's a tricky thing. There's not plenty. I mean, it's hard for anyone to get into comics, but I think when you're a writer who can't draw, it's a tricky thing unless you're basically willing to pay an artist, and that's just something you kind of have to do, unfortunately.
If the Thought Bubble competition hadn't happened, or if, you know, the wandering eye of Tharg hadn't alighted on you like Sauron from Mount Doom, what would you have done? How would you have proceeded from that point?
That is a very, I don't know, to be honest. I would like to say I would still be writing comics in this way, but I think it can be quite a difficult industry to keep going past a certain point. When you're looking to do it professionally, I think it can be very difficult. I say this, I probably would have gone back the next year to the thought of the competition again. I think I would still be writing no matter what, but I potentially might have started looking into other areas.
And 2080 is one of those comics where this isn't meant to in any way be a criticism or a complaint. It is its own ecosystem.
Right.
It exists in its own bubble to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Many of our readers read no other comics.
Mm-hmm.
We have creators who don't work anywhere else. Are you quite happy to remain at 2000 AD, or have you got one eye elsewhere?
I mean, I enjoy writing for 2000 AD and hope to continue, but I'm definitely open to other publishers. Like I've got two, I can't talk about, but I've got two projects with a US publisher that should hopefully be coming out early next year. So, absolutely love writing for it, but as you say, it's its own ecosystem, and man cannot live on Dredd alone.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much indeed to Rory for chatting away there. Next up is Adam Sherif, who is a comic critic who I've known for some time, and we decided that we wanted to talk about Judge Anderson Shamballa, which is one of those stories which just everything about it, the writer, the artist, the story, everything seems to come together. So it was an absolute pleasure to be able to chat to Adam. One small point, all the way through this, we refer to Psychop Judge Asimov. It's entirely my fault. There is literally a copy of Asimov's Robot Stories in my eyeline. It is, of course, Mikhail Amazov. I hope that doesn't spoil your enjoyment. But it was great to be able to talk to Adam and do a deep dive into Judge Anderson Shamballa. Let's start off. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, Adam.
Sure. So I am a comics critic. I write for The Beat and Panel by Panel. And I used to do PR for Orbital Comics back in the day, managing their social media and relationships and things like that. I'm also an academic, a historian really, but I'm focusing on Second World War comics as historical evidence. Those are the main comics related things, I think. Oh no, I also do a podcast called Comic Book Classroom, which is history and comedy sketches and music as kind of like bite-sized presentations of different things from comics.
Excellent. Exactly the person that we want to dive into some 2000 AD. Now, when we were discussing which story to go with for this, you brought up Judge Anderson Shamballa. Now, as anybody will know who's been a long-term listener to the Thrillcast, this is one of my all-time favourite comic book stories. Never mind just Dredd World stuff. It was something that had a profound effect on me when I first read it. Do you want to talk a little bit about your reasoning why you chose this?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think I chose Anderson Shamballa for a couple of reasons. One is that I love the character as a whole, as an idea, and in stories, as a kind of, not necessarily a counterpoint, I guess, to Dredd, but a different perspective on the world of Megacity 1. And it's a different way, Anderson's a way to explore different themes within that world, and that world is really rich, and there are tons of incredible stories set in it. But for me, Anderson brings something wildly different to the table, and it's partly because of her psi abilities, but it's also because of the characterization. As for choosing Shamballa in particular, a couple of years ago back at Orbital, we had an Arthur Ranson exhibition, and my mind was blown. His catalogue of work is incredible, and his style is not really something that you see imitated. It's for me, it's really singular. It has a lot to do with almost like photo surrealism. There's something incredibly uncanny about the way he draws. And there's more stuff we can get into, but the detail and the layouts, there's a lot happening. And this is one of those books that I see in the same vein as kind of, it's 1990, I think, that they start telling the story. There or thereabouts, but I see it in the same vein as a lot of that late 80s, early 90s, really thoughtful socio-political comic storytelling, in the same vein as like The Question or Dark Knight Returns, that kind of stuff. But for me, it's doing a lot of different things from some of those other books. So it was something I wanted to kind of dig into and revisit more seriously. And I'd say this is my favorite 2000 AD book.
I'm not going to argue with you on that point. It's a breathtaking piece of work. Let's talk a bit more about Ranson, because this is one of those stories where people often talk about the interplay between the artist and writer, and what that brings to what that brings to comic books that make them unique.
Yeah.
That you have effectively two authors, 3 if you want to include the editor, 4 if you want to include the letterer.
Yeah.
And quite often that can be a mechanical process. The writer tells the artist what to draw. The artist draws it. Job's a good one. But this is one of those stories, and 2000 AD has a plethora of these stories and series where I think so much of the story is thanks to the way that Arthur Ranson does it. It's a good story. It's a great story. It's one of Alan Grant's best. But Ranson's artwork takes it to a place that I think a less adept, a less skilled comic book artist just wouldn't be able to take it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things you can tell from reading this about their creative relationship is that there's enormous amount of trust from Grant to Ranson. It's not like free reign, but you can tell that Grant knows when to pull back and not overload the pages with text, and trust Ranson to tell the story, which he does. And I think a lot of the emotional beats are actually left to Ranson and how he draws expressions, rather than captions saying, Anderson feels this way. It's left to Ranson to really put that across. And one of my favorite things is that any group scene he draws, every background non-speaking character, every non-speaking character on the page has a facial expression and has a response to the situation, which gives the reader more perspective. You're not just getting the main character's response to whatever's happening. You're getting a ton of people, whoever's there, everyone's thinking about something, and Ranson can illustrate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it. There have been so many people who've been quite cruel towards Ranson's artwork over the years, and there was. I'm not going to repeat it here, but there was a mocking nickname that people gave him, suggested he was just copying photos. And I had the great privilege to go and interview Arthur some time ago. And the thing is, yes, looking at photos, looking at reference is a major part of it. But it's so much. His artwork is so much more than that, because it as you said, there's a realism there.
Yeah.
That he manages to incorporate things that look real. Things you could imagine existing very easily, but imbues them with a futurism, a kind of almost like Dan Dare, post-Dan Dare futurism that you only really get from British comics, you know?
Totally. I think, people will say, oh, it's photoreal comics. For me, it's like, I think I said it before, it's photo-surreal, because he's doing something way beyond photoreal. Like, yes, you can see the relationship to how it looks, quote unquote, kind of real, but he's doing something way beyond that in terms of his aesthetic. It's really uncanny. And like you say, you could imagine it being real, but you also kind of can't. And a lot of his designs also speak to that. But the Dan Dare thing, I think I totally agree with, because I think Ranson is drawing on the tradition of a style of British comics that you just don't see anywhere else. You know, Eagle Battle, but also stuff like Girl. Like, a lot of his layouts match romance comics paneling. And I think, like, he's not getting credit for that, but it's actually really clever, and it's a great way. Like, in this story, you get a lot of it, obviously, with Anderson and Asimov. And some of the ways that he's, positioning the characters within the panels are from that tradition. But I think because of the kind of surreal quality, it's less obvious, which to me is really clever.
I mean, that's his career. You know, he had a huge career before he'd even got to 2000 AD. You know, he was a veteran before that point. So you're absolutely right. He's drawing. You look at Look and Learn, and Look In, which he did work for, and Girls Comics. And there is that variety of layout of thinking of not necessarily just how the story is being told, but actually interesting things to draw the eye, and to break up the monotony of panel.
I think that's a key thing. His pacing's incredible, and he's really, really adept at controlling the speed with which the reader is going to look through the page, by varying layouts, either to densely pack them and really slow down into the intricacies of a moment between two characters, or to zoom out. And his splash pages feel like you're staring at a scene for 10, 20 seconds. The cityscapes, when they get to kind of East Meg 2, and you see the cityscape, and you're like, wow, this is his, post-Soviet vision. And it's incredible. You could stare at it, and it almost looks like it's moving. It's that kind of richly detailed. That stuff's happening. So I think I would agree. He's definitely underappreciated as a storyteller, but especially for me in the context of his layouts, and the way he sequences panels.
What was interesting about interviewing him was just how much of this seems to be intuitive, seems to be innate. He talked about, I had these books and I drew on these, and there were bits of it in the script, and I had an interest in this stuff. But there seems almost to be a playfulness with the way he draws on things. When Anderson gets to with Rickard gets to East Meg 2, and they get into a vehicle with the Sov judges, and it's a DeLorean. It's basically just a DeLorean.
Just a DeLorean.
So there's a kind of nice little bit of kind of harking back. There's always symbolism in the choices he's making, even if he's not consciously making that symbolic choice. Even if he's thinking, this ties into a grand unifying theory of what I want to say. It's just nice little things that you see and go, oh, that's really nice. That's a good little joke.
Yeah. I like that, actually. And I think that playfulness is actually matched sometimes in the way that Grant characterizes Anderson. It's not a levity, but there's a kind of sardonic element to her, where she's just like, okay, pal, I'll get in this cave, whatever it is. And she's almost flippant about it, which I think is a nice thing that they both throw in at different moments. I wouldn't say the book is marked by its levity, but there are these little things that really make it. But at the same time, the kind of really trippy sequences in this book in Shamballa, where, Anderson is seeing a kind of vision of all of her worst nightmares and stuff like that. For me, that the illustration is in Doctor Strange, Steve Ditko territory. You know, as far as like the way that Ranson uses symmetry and then breaks it and uses asymmetry. There's a brilliant page, which is kind of her worst nightmares, and it's almost like a classic comics recap page. You know, you see like Judge Death is there. Everything that bad that has happened in Anderson's life is captured in this beautiful kind of symmetric page. Then it's all coming out of her head. It's, you know, masterful storytelling.
Absolutely. And it's as I said, comics are unique in the relationship between the writer and artist. On books like 2000 AD, it's particularly unusual because often the writers and artists have had no contact.
Right.
And I can't remember specifically whether Alan and Arthur had contact on this, but as you say, it's an element of trust.
Yeah.
You know, knowing that, I guess from the writer's perspective, if the pages are coming in and the editor thinks, well, these are rubbish, and it's the editor who will pick that up. But that initial choice is one based on trust. I trust the editor.
Yeah.
To take on that relationship, you know. One thing I did want to talk about, particularly in terms of Ranson's art, is color. And the use of color to denote temperature. Because rereading it myself, what I was really struck with is particularly when they're on the train heading out into the Siberian waste.
The Trans-Siberian Railway, yeah.
It's just how Ranson's use of color is so bold, is so strong. Like when you sort of kind of isolate the color from its surroundings, you realize just how little filtering the color is going through. You know, it's bold, it is strong. In some cases, it's almost straight out of the tube. But he uses that in such a way that you get the sense of snow.
Yeah.
You know, you
it's
get
almost like you can feel it. I think you're right. He uses color super effectively to control mood as well as temperature. I really hadn't thought about the temperature thing, but it's dead on. You feel like those scenes out on the railway are freezing. You feel it. And the city feels dense and full and kind of stifling. One thing I really noticed about the colors is that for a lot of the cityscape scenes, he uses a kind of sandy beige, which when you see the judges step out into the streets, you realize how menacing they look in really dark, but also kind of vibrant. No one else is dressed like that. No one else, those colors are not present anywhere else apart from on the outfits of the judges. And that's really effective, you know, because you see the cityscape, you see the scene, and then you see these kind of really menacing figures, even unintentionally, like when they're stepping into the DeLorean and you think this is kind of wacky, but they stand out. Yeah, his color use is really bold. And it's going a long way to kind of constructing the mood of the scene. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And I think the one time he drains to black and white is that scene with Anderson's nightmares, which is brilliant. But you've also got little touches like, I forget the name of the doctor that Anderson talks to in the little chopper ride over to East Meg 2.
It's Rickard.
Yeah, it is Rickard. And there's a moment where they're talking about something, and Rickard's glasses are colored in the white. The eyes of it are colored in the white of the panel border of the gutter, which has this brilliant effect of whatever he's saying, you don't quite believe him. You know that there's more going on because you cannot see his eyes, which is disconcerting, you know. And it puts you in Anderson's position, and you understand why she is becoming increasingly skeptical of what she's being told. Which is, again, super effective use of color.
Well, it's I mean, it's a metaphor in of itself. The opaque glasses suggest he can't. He's working on two layers there. Number one, he's wearing glasses, which is quite rare to see on a judge.
True.
They look opaque to us. So, you know, he is unseeing for all of his intelligence.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I do want to talk about later is the use of cultural motifs. But I find it fascinating. It's one of the things I love about the story is how many different elements Ranson is drawing on, and directed in many cases by Grant's script, but it feels like just through the use of symbolism that the world is so much richer. This isn't just about Megacity 1. This isn't just about the judges. This is something larger. And I'd be interested to know what you thought of the use of symbols and symbolism all the way through.
Yeah, I think you can tell it's something I think the creative team are putting in a really conscious way. It's also, we mentioned trust, and I think they put a lot of trust and faith in the reader to unpack things for themselves. Rather than having to be told this means this. I mentioned there's a lot of play with symmetry, which I think is and it's broken into asymmetry sometimes really, really purposefully. And I think that is speaking to the kind of internal moral conflict Anderson's going through. That for me is like the heart of this story. And I think there's a lot of ways that they are kind of playing with that and exploring different elements of it, because the wider context, I guess, is Judge Corey's recent suicide, and Anderson questioning, I guess, whether there's room for humanity or compassion within the system of the judges and within the law. For me, the symmetry is the thing that stood out kind of symbolically, but there's also, I guess, less in terms of visual, but in terms of kind of narrative stuff, there's a lot of psychogeography going on. So when they reach Agati or Shamballa, Anderson reflects, I think it's in the narrative captions, and she says something to the effect of, she can feel all the lives that were here and all the gods that they worship that we have no idea about. And it's just that thing of embedding within the text more to the world that we will never see, but it enriches the experience because you understand the world that they're creating has a lot more depth, rather than just what we're faced with on the page, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's there's a richness in what both of them are doing. That sense of alluding to things, referencing things that you're there's stupid internet memes where all the words are reversed, or like the first and the last words, and it goes, oh, if you can read this, you're a genius, which of course bollocks, because that's just how the human mind works.
How the mind works.
That is so important in rich texts like this, because your mind is doing lots of filling in for it. It feels rich because you are being asked to actually do quite a lot of the heavy lifting, but in a way that satisfies the mind, because if it sees a gap that it wants to fill, you get a little endorphin rush. But if you don't necessarily get that gap, but then you don't see it. I mean, coming to the whole relation to Anderson of the story, of course, the overriding theme, literally the thread that runs through the entire story is W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming, which is one of those poems which gets referenced a lot, particularly at times of crisis.
Right.
As one of those poets with a lot of baggage, a lot of history that comes with him as well, I wondered what you thought about Grant's use of a poem like that in something in this story in particular.
Well, I think one of the things I noticed that I guess it kind of links with that actually is that this book has a lot more looking at religion than I thought it did, or than I remembered that it did. And then maybe that ties back into the symbolism that you were mentioning, but there's a lot of Anderson, at least, going through kind of monologues around like defiling sacred land and doing ugly things, which I thought was fascinating. And not unexpected, but I actually did not expect the religious aspect to be so prevalent, to be honest. I don't know how that maybe ties to the Yeats poem.
Well, it's the way that I read it, and again, this is exploring a theme rather than necessarily this is exactly what Grant.
No, of course, yeah.
I'm always very wary of ever saying this is exactly what the author did, because you can't necessarily. I contrast its use in this with the other sort of biggest use, I guess, which is Chinua Achebe's novel "Things Fall Apart," which is about a crisis of masculinity, whereas Grant always seems with Anderson to be using her as a counterpoint to Dredd, who is rigid, he's order, he's masculine, and all those concepts. And so, whereas Achebe used the poem to talk about the collapse of the crisis in power, I guess with Anderson, I've always felt that that Grant is using the Second Coming to talk about a crisis of faith.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I can see how that. I mean, that's a major thread here for sure. And I think there's something. I think the chief judge says before they go on the adventure, which is to the tune of whatever is going on here is much bigger than the conflict between Megacity 1 and East Meg 2, which is like, as you're saying, like that's your first tip off for the reader that this is not just going to be Cold War, politics played out as a 2000 AD story. And I really like that thread. And I like in particular, and it's one of the things you actually said about, I think, Grant before we started, which is he's very deliberate and he's not as big on ambiguity as some people are. And when Anderson confronts the gateway figure within Shamballa, who is the kind of the center holding the world together, she literally shoots him and walks out. And it's incredible because she's going through this crisis of faith. And the wider story is that potentially the world is ending. All these myths are coming to life. And I really like the passage where we get to visit the different myths of different places around the world, all kind of coming to fruition in a very, very real way. That stuff's incredible. But to get to the kind of crux of the story, Anderson's in the monastery and she literally shoots the myth and disavows it and walks out. And when she emerges kind of by herself from the monastery, that page is phenomenal. It is so decisive. Her body language is confident, defiant, almost breezy. It's like she's been through a thing and she's like, well, I'm glad we're done with that. And that's it, which is incredible, considering kind of the weight of the themes that the book is dealing with. For Grant and Ranson to be like, no, this is how it goes, is extremely bold. And yet does not necessarily leave a lot of room for ambiguity. But at the same time, the experience of it and what Anderson sees and the way it changes her for subsequent stories, the ambiguity is there. She does question that experience.
I love that moment you're talking about where she's striding past all the bodies of her vanquished foes effectively. She's not looking at them, her eyes are closed, she's walking with her head right up so she can't see them. And that's a metaphor. She's looking up at the heavens. She's not wallowing in the muck and the mire of the day-to-day. She's keeping her eyes fixed, and it's a restoration of faith, the idea that there is that point of light in the distance that you can fix on and keep faith. Coming back to talking about the moment where she shoots Mikhail and then goes to shoot the umbilicus mundi, the center of the world.
Center of the world.
And I only noticed this recently. It only just occurred to me. all the way through, you get these page-wide thin panels that are usually referencing the web.
Yeah.
The web of reality that bind everything, and you see the cancer that spreads through it, and the strands snap. But it's always, well, almost exclusively in these thin, narrow panels. So the panel structure is mimicking what you're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then she shoots Mikhail. And there's 2 panels on that page just before she goes to try and shoot the old guy, where she is shown in those 2 page wide thin panels.
Mm.
Her moment, her sacrifice, her actions have healed. Like, it is literally showing that she has now stepped into the gap, that her sacrifice, her actions have brought those strands back together again. And that is meta level page design. I very much doubt that was in the script. That is, I would put money on it being Ranson, whether consciously or unconsciously doing that. But that is so brave. That is so strong as an act on the page, you know?
Yeah, and you're right, because I think it's embedded in the text before and after as well. There's a moment earlier where the line "the center won't hold" appears. And Anderson literally destroys that center. But the act of her kind of sacrifice and her experience restores that balance, which is, and it is kind of rendered in this really formalist way where it's like, that's what's happening, but it's also literally what you're looking at. And that's incredible storytelling. It's hard to say whether that's, conscious paneling. I would say it probably is. For me, I would give Ranson the benefit of the doubt on that, for sure. Because I think a lot of the layouts are part of the story. It's not just the information within the panels, and that's good comics.
And that's the strength of this story.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think one of the strengths of Grant as a writer as well is that he's talking about this stuff. Like he's not somebody who idly throws words onto a page. And it seems to represent so many. I've talked to him a few times, and his interest in esotericism and Eastern philosophy. He followed a guru for a little while until he discovered that he was a binman or something like that. You can't help but look at the parallels, the symmetry of the whole thing. You've got East and West, you've got male and female, and it's Mikhail who gets bitten.
Yep.
Mikhail who gets infected, and it's he who is going to destroy everything. And there's that incredible moment when he's about to bite Anderson, and he says, "I can't stop myself."
Yeah, I mean, if that's not metaphorical, meta storytelling, I don't know what is. But I and it's tricky as a thing to kind of include in the comic. But what I like is that is the moment where he says that, and Anderson flicks the switch. There's no more her kind of any impetus to compassion or to reasoning it out is gone. She understands at that point that's the gambit, and she is going to have to, and she, without hesitation, as she does in so many stories, without hesitation, she makes the call and she pulls the trigger on him, which I think is the right way of moving through something as tricky as that, especially like in the context of, we're not an all male creative team, but lead male creative team. That I think that is the most kind of effective way they would have been able to have the character move through that, if that follows.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Anderson for a moment as a character, because we've already kind of touched on this, how Grant and John Wagner as well, very much you have the soft feminine side to go alongside Dredd. She's a psychic, she's an empath, she's about feelings, women's stuff, if you forgive me on that. So it's fascinating to see the direction that Grant then takes her in once she splits off effectively from the main strip, from out of Dredd's shadow. And I want to get your feelings on that, because I've seen people write about how it's a kind of abdication of responsibility by making the soft stuff about the woman and the action stuff about the man. But Anderson, for me, I think he's a much more complex character than that. And I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would agree, actually. I'd say it's hard to speak to. I mean, I can't speak to whether Anderson reads authentically for a woman, right? Like, I don't know. It's not really for me to be able to say that. But I do think that the depth and complexity and complication that she's given as a character is incredibly rewarding. I think I understand, I guess, that criticism, like Dredd is the male stuff and all the action orientated stuff. And Anderson has a lot more to do with feelings. And to a certain extent, that is true. Like, that's the basis, she's been given those abilities. And that's where the character kind of exists, on that kind of threshold. But I think within that, for me, that stuff is more interesting. Like Dredd's internal conflict, to the extent that there is one, is not really the moral conflict Anderson has. It's his frustration when the law falls short of justice. That's when he's mad, when he's hamstrung and he can't enact the justice he really thinks needs to be the case. And in that way, he's an objectivist archetype. And I think, actually, to give credit to a lot of the people who have written and drawn Dredd, for me, he's a much better examination of objectivism than Rorschach in Watchmen, who is too straw man for it to really work, for me. But, and I'm a huge fan of Ditko's, not necessarily of objectivism, but I'm a big Ditko fan, so I'm into The Question and Mr. A. And I think Judge Dredd is such an interesting examination of that archetype. But the stuff that you can get into with Anderson, I think it has infinitely more potential resonance for a reader. Like, Dredd's internal conflict is not relatable. It's interesting, and it's a great way of exploring things. But I think what Anderson experiences, especially in this story, I think there's a lot of potential resonance there. She's asking herself, and she refers to the things that judges do as being potentially ugly. And I don't think that's frivolous language. I think it's really serious. And I think the impact of her friend's suicide is enormous on her, because from my understanding, Corey couldn't live within that system and couldn't continue to enact those things. So I think to follow a character like Anderson, kind of trying to navigate her own way through an unfeeling system, as a person who obviously has retained a degree of compassion and humanity, that for me is such an interesting thing to do within the Megacity 1 Dredd world. I think it's a completely different dimension than you can get into with Dredd himself. So that's kind of why I gravitate towards Anderson. It's why I'm interested in the character. And there's a kind of broader contextual thing. And this is personal history stuff. But for me, growing up in the UK, right, I didn't see a lot of characters in media that looked like me, okay? That much is obvious. But what I always found was I would gravitate towards characters that were women because it was often the nearest kind of other within the story. There was always going to be there's always a female character. For the X-Men, it was Rogue or it was Storm or whatever. And I could find a lot more resonance and relatability with their stories than I could the main hero, And that holds true from my experience of reading 2000 AD. So I find Dredd super interesting as an exercise, but Anderson is much more interesting on like a personal level and in terms of that potential, relating to a piece of art and what you can get out of it on an emotional level. So yeah, I understand that the easy out of giving Anderson those things, but I also think that particularly this set of creators have tried to do something really meaningful with that.
Yeah, you look at the kind of gamut of stories to do with Anderson, and at one end you've got things like Engram, which is effectively an inward-looking journey to do with the past. You look at something like Shamballa, which is all about doubt and faith, and whether one can rise to the challenge of what Judge Corey said, which is, can you be a good person in a bad system?
Yeah,
and that is a whole other podcast right there. Then you get Childhood's End, where even the notion of hope falls. So, with Shambhala, you get into a little bit of faith, the idea that you can just focus on the one good thing. If you just hope, then you can take yourself through it. And then she encounters aliens who basically go, you are cattle. There is no point to you.
Nothing to you.
Other than, mindless workers. So then she goes off on her self-imposed exile.
Right, yeah.
Cards on the edge stuff. And what's interesting is that it takes some time to get back round to the questions that Shambhala asks, because it said, "Can you be a good person in a bad system?" She comes back to the city because of crisis, and her conclusion seems to be, well, there are worse things out there than the judges,
right?
And it's chaotic out there, but at least here is certainty. At least within this system, I can try and do some good. And you see that also in Triad, which is another Arthur Ranson story when he was working in black and white. One of my absolute favorites, which again is about abuse and about trying to do good in a flawed system when real evil exists. And I think that's ultimately where Grant seems to come down, which is that. Where there is real evil, the solution to that may not be perfect, but it is nonetheless a solution.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also read Satan, which is another Ranson Grant story, and Anderson almost literally faces down the devil. And one of the conclusions she draws as another way... I think you're right. I think one of the things that happens in Anderson's stories is she is always looking for the thing to sustain her journey. Okay, that's enough to go on for now, that little bit of hope. And in the story where she faces down Satan, one of the things she says is it doesn't matter if it's really Satan or he just thinks that he's Satan. What matters is what her choice is in the face of that. And I think her guiding principle, at least at the end of that story, is it is always down to the individual to make the choice, and that's your moral responsibility. And I think that's the kind of thread. It's, if you're not necessarily always doing good, don't be doing harm, and I think that's a fascinating thing, because she's a cog within this very inhumane system, and she is constantly grappling with her own morality, but also her own complicity. And that's amazing. One of the reasons I think it's so interesting to be reading this now is Anderson's a way of looking at systemic problems and assessing your own culpability within it, which is, something I think at this point that we're all kind of trying to wrestle with on some level. And I think Grant and Ranson have a real sensitivity to it. I don't think Grant's he doesn't leave a lot of room for ambiguity, but he does leave a lot of room for humanity. There's a lot of space, emotional space and narrative space within which Anderson exists, and within which she's on this bizarre but kind of meaningful journey. And I like that ultimately in Shamballa, the emotional thread is something that's, I think, is very relatable, even though the actual journey she goes on is completely wacky, you know, to kind of like the center of the earth and the center of all things. But really, it's a question of doubt and faith. And how do you keep going and trying to justify what you're doing?
I always come back to my Brecht with stories like this, which is the surest thing in life is doubt.
Right.
You know, and it's. I mean, you're entirely right about Dredd. One of the things I've come to conclude about Dredd, or at least to ponder, is he's the terror of modernism.
Mm.
He's the terror of a world in which once you're aware of something, you have to take action, and that action in of itself can be a terror.
Right. Yeah.
So it is utilitarian. It's objectivist.
Yeah.
It's Nietzschean. You know, he is the TikTok man and the Übermensch rolled into one. But with Anderson, she represents an older philosophical tradition that goes back into you kind of try to think of the correct person to name here, otherwise I'm going to get emails. Your pre-enlightenment.
Interesting.
Because it's about spiritualism. It's about the journey within, not, you know, what system can we create to make humankind efficient or right? How can we, you know, hers is not a philosophy that asks, how can we cure mankind? It's what can I do? And Grant's fascination with philosophy and Eastern spirituality, for want of a better phrase, it just shines through in his attitude towards this character.
I think that's really interesting. And as you were saying that, I thought of the historian Eric Hobsbawm talks about the 20th century as the age of extremes, and like Dredd is all of those extremes at once. He's all of the things from the 20th century to their extreme, all at once, all the time. And that's how he is. Which, as you say rightly, is completely terrifying. And that's, kind of what I was saying before, like, hopefully that is completely unrealistic. Like, a person cannot exist like that. That's not possible. Which is why, Dredd's unrelatable, I think. I think he should be unrelatable. Fingers crossed. But he does, you're right, he does represent a lot of those 20th century ideas, a lot of those Nietzschean ideas. But I think as much as Anderson has ties to that kind of spirituality and pre-enlightenment stuff and intuitive ways of existing in the world, I think she's also post, in the sense that I think she's kind of post-structuralist. She's post-Dredd, because she's one of the only characters in this world that can correctly perceive the structures that she's living in. She can correctly assess, like, this is the system, this is what the judges are, this is the way the law functions in this world. And she's one of the only ones who's kind of post that and can actually assess it. You're right that she stops short of being like, how do I fix this for the world? Her thing is, how do I live within this? How do I justify myself? And that's the pre-enlightenment stuff. But I think she's an incredible, like, bracketing of those two things, like pre and post. And Dredd is in the middle, just being like, there's only yes and no, it's only black and white. And Anderson can see a lot more than that. And I think that's a great counterpoint, but also a great way of exploring a world that was built around Dredd. So it's like, how does someone else exist within this? Not everyone can be like him. So how does somebody else with more kind of humanity navigate that?
I was talking to a friend a little while ago, and we were talking about how difficult it's actually been for writers, not just John Wagner and Alan Grant, both writers, to spin off characters from Dredd that aren't just another version of Dredd in another city.
Tricky.
Exactly. And it's not really until Wagner has built up a cast of supporting characters. It wasn't really until writers like Rob Williams came along and Al Ewing and Simon Spurrier and Michael Carroll, where and I particularly want to identify Williams here. Where those characters are themselves a critique of the very thing they're spinning off of. So you look at somebody like Dirty Frank and Amy Nixon from Low Life, and the Small House with Smiley and all this. Rather than just replicate that monolithic slab over there, we're going to look at the people who are actually chipping away at it, who aren't as certain, who aren't these figures of I mean, Dredd would see himself as a figure of moral authority, as all great authoritarians do. But you know, it's fascinating that in the last 10, 15 years, we're finally in a situation where writers are able to challenge Dredd's ubiquity and hold over this world in a way that Grant has been doing for 40 years.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's an important thing to do because comics are sequential stories that have to track change over time, right? It's why they make for incredible historical evidence, because they keep coming out in a serialized way and they will always reflect the world in which they were made. And I think you're right to point to the more modern stuff that is asking those questions. And it's using different characters to explore that, which, is kind of what Grant and Ranson were doing, you know, in their time with Anderson. I think that stuff's vital. And it's, you mentioned Jacques Derrida before we started. And like, you know, his thing is, it's the thing, but different and deferred. Like, what's the thing that comes after and how is it different? And then how do we construct meaning between those two things? So, you know, meaning exists between the poles of Dredd and Anderson. And that is, you know, that can be really satisfying storytelling and satisfying reading, you know. So.
If you want to get really, really metaphorical, then Anderson is introduced as a character at the time that Dredd is facing death himself. So in the face of the end, you migrate to two poles, you know. But anyway, we're not going to get into that.
I will say just on Dredd and Anderson, there's a moment in the Satan story where after Anderson has vanquished the devil, and Dredd couldn't do it. You know, Dredd yells at the devil, the sentence is death, and tries to shoot. Like, it's really funny. It's great. But there's a moment he picks Anderson up off the floor and he says, he apologizes because he recognizes that they are actually friends. And that's like, oh, she's had an impact on him and he has changed in response to what has happened. And for me, that was like, that's really profound, because obviously you don't really see that a lot with Dredd. But it was nice to see him recognize that as a kind of gesture.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. By the point that Satan came out, that was what, 93, 94?
Mm-hmm.
And then mid-90s.
Yeah.
Wagner and Grant hadn't been writing together for 5 years by that point.
Right.
At least 5 years, because their partnership had broken up when they finished The Last American. So the version of Dredd that exists in the Anderson stories of Alan Grant is often not the same Dredd. Doesn't necessarily, not that he sounds wrong, but he sounds different.
Yeah,
he behaves slightly differently, and that for me is a key moment in Satan, where he says, you know, I was mistaken, I am your friend. So the fact that happened in the mid-90s, at a time when Dredd as a character under Ennis and Miller and Morrison was actually losing nuance.
Yeah.
Wagner eventually has come round post-millennium to introducing nuance into the character in a way that Grant has been doing for 30 years, you know?
Totally agree. Yeah.
I want to bring it back to Shamballa.
Absolutely.
Because just to round off, really, because this has been fascinating. Like I said, I'd happily talk about this stuff.
I mean, thank you for having me on. It's fun.
It's an absolute pleasure. My other half with us living in two rooms, doesn't necessarily want to talk about Judge Dredd when we've both finished working from home. But just to get you, having had this chat, having thought about the context of it, what your feelings towards Shamballa as a story are now, rereading it, revisiting it, how has it surprised you the most?
I think one of the most striking things is the thread of, like, as I mentioned, complicity within systems, because that is incredibly present as a theme now. And this is something that, Grant and Ranson were addressing in the early 90s, just as it was a theme then. But for me, it was, I think it was pretty striking because they handle it with a really incredible mixture of kind of nuance, but also certainty, and the other, as far as reading it now, I still don't see comics that look like this. I can appreciate, as I can with any art style, it's not for everyone, it's totally subjective. You may appreciate different kinds of art. Fine. But I think the merits on a level of craft of what Ranson does is, that's pretty unimpeachable. Like, you can say you don't like it, but you can't say it's bad craft. It's very, very good, sophisticated storytelling. And I love the sense of harmony that they have together, and the trust. And I'm always interested in the gap between intention and effect, and what we get out as readers is not always going to be the same as what was intended. And that's great. That's why art is worthwhile. It's not just someone telling you something. And I think this really holds up. I think it's underappreciated as one of those kind of post-superhero, post-structuralist kind of late 80s, early 90s comics. I think it should be in the kind of conversation alongside The Question and Watchmen and, Daredevil, all that stuff.
One thing I do want to address before we finish is something I brought up towards the beginning of our chat, which particularly at the moment, but this has been something that a conversation that's been going on for many years. There are concerns about cultural appropriation in comic books, particularly in such a visual medium where it is easy to take a kind of postmodern point of view, which is just borrowing from everywhere. And how well you think the different elements of Eastern religion, esotericism, other cultures are handled in something like this? Because for me it works, but I'm a white middle-aged middle-class man, so I'm not necessarily best placed to comment on that. But for me, it works because it's not abusing them. It feels sympathetic.
Right. That's interesting. There's a really good question, actually. I think the more obvious thing for me is it's two guys telling a story with a lead woman character. And inevitably, they're not going to hit that authentic voice because they can't speak with it. You know what I mean? Like, I think they show a lot of grace with the character, and they give her a lot of nuance and complication. But it's hard to say, like, on what level is that authentic? I don't really know. It wouldn't be for me to say, as I mentioned. As far as the cultural kind of contexts that they visit, I don't get the sense. I mean, for one, it's not mean-spirited, obviously. I think it's an exploration of various mythologies as a means to tell this story. So you have that segment where all the myths from the different parts of the world have come alive. And Agartha or Shamballa as a concept, obviously, is tied to specific cultures. I think it's tricky. I think where I guess they're they're kind of safer from appropriation is that they're not presenting characters from those places and mimicking their voice. They're having characters from their own world and with, over which they've got a certain kind of control, and having them explore these places, which is definitely fraught sometimes, and it can be, but they don't have any exchanges in the story with people from those places. So it avoids some of the potential pitfalls of kind of animating people from other places in a certain way. I guess the part where maybe it falls down, to be honest, is when they first arrive and you've got kind of like the East and Western characters, the Russians and the Americans or whatever, and they're ambushed by a bunch of local Asian appearing soldiers. And in service to the narrative they're telling, like all of these characters just get killed, so that our heroes can just continue on their journey. It's tricky, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that element of it, to be honest. I don't think as far as harnessing the mythologies and stuff, it's too problematic, because I don't think they're using it. It's almost like it's the dressing. It's not like, I think Anderson's journey is serious, but I think the contexts they're visiting are just a kind of mystique. Like, I don't think it's meant to be a serious exploration of the myths around Shamballa. That's just the guise for Anderson to go on this journey. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that it's doing anything obviously terrible. Not that I could pick up on, but it's a good question. And I feel like I don't have an authoritative answer.
Well, that's I always find it. That's why it is a good question.
Yeah,
because it makes you question choices, not necessarily to call them good or bad, or to say they should or shouldn't be done, but just to always have in your mind a questioning eye.
For sure. And I think as a comics critic, I'd say it's one of the strengths of my work is picking up on stuff that's kind of essentialist and breaking that down and saying why it doesn't work or why it's unhelpful. And for me, reading this and revisiting it, I wasn't kind of like tipped off and being like, oh, I didn't have that sense, actually. It felt very almost abstract, just kind of mythological in this very kind of loose, intangible way. And actually the kind of feeling of it is more the core than the mythology, which is pretty well represented again by Anderson, like shooting the gateway, being like, well, that's done. It was never going to be about her really addressing those myths and working out like the truth of it. The same way that when she confronts the devil, it's like, it doesn't matter if it's really the devil. Like, that's not what the story's about. Other readers might have a different read, for sure, and I have to say, like, for I can't speak to a lot of the cultures that kind of touched on in this book, so I can't say authoritatively either, but like, for me, it didn't necessarily trigger any kind of alarms,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know, and it's fascinating. It's probably a subject for an entire different episode in the future, but I will round it off. Just say thank you so much for chatting about this. It's been absolutely fascinating. And,
no question. Thanks a lot.
Super stuff. Thank you so much to Rory and to Adam for chatting. We'll be back in 7 days' time or thereabouts for more from the lockdown tapes. Again, if you want to get in touch, then please do so at thrillcast@2000ad.com. See you next time, Earthlets. Stay safe, and as always, keep it 2000 AD. Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.